Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, good afternoon. My name is Scott McKenzie. I'm the CEO of PMG Funds. It is an absolute pleasure to be actually out and seeing and talking to you guys in the flesh, as I'm sure you are as well, to come out and have a drink. We did think, as part of our strategy today, having done a number of virtual presentations over the last couple of months, I guess, to ply you with alcohol and food first and just see what happens in terms of the sales process over the coming hour or so. So thank you for your bit of time today. I want to introduce Dennis McMahon shortly. Dennis is the founding director of our business. I founded PMG back in 1992. So Dennis has been here since day one and essentially has guided PMG, our funds and our investors through what has been the last 28 years in a number of economic cycles. So Den's going to spend a little bit of time just up front, just perhaps sharing a couple of thoughts around where we see things at the moment from, I guess, a global and macro perspective. Just want to introduce you to Jordan Forrest. Jordan's our man on the ground down here, so our investor relations man, looks after our existing clients down in Christchurch, got a little office in Sydenham there. So no doubt if there's any questions, feel free to have a chat with Jordan in due course. And Matt McCarty out the back, Matt's head of the team and investor relationships. Matt will talk to you a bit about the office fund and the new offer that we've got coming up. So as many of you will be aware, we're acquiring the Vodafone building there in Tuam Street. Went through it today. Great to see Vodafone have got almost all of their staff back now in the office again and things up and running. So certainly been an interesting 8 weeks, certainly for ourselves as a property funds manager, facing into what has been no doubt challenging times for most in the industry and certainly across a number of sectors. We'll talk a bit about what I guess COVID has done for commercial real estate and what some of the insights we're seeing around some maybe structural shifts moving forward as well. So I guess firstly more so, I'll hand over to Den now to do a bit of big picture, talk a bit about office and the future of office. Probably some of you have heard that from various commentators around the traps, office buildings are now dead, we're all working from home, let's just lock them up and throw away the key, no need for office anymore. So here to dispel some of those sort of myths today and talk a bit about sort of reasons why with some of the research we've done. Matt will talk about the office fund. So PMG Direct Office Fund's actually an existing fund of PMG. It's actually been one of our best performing funds since we established it in 2016. And so Matt will talk about the fund a little bit and as to what the acquisition with Vodafone building means and in terms of building resilience for our portfolio from an income perspective and the aggregate mass ensuing from that. So firstly, I'll hand across now to Dennis, who's just going to talk you through a bit about the bigger picture, and then I'll talk you through the office environment. Over to you, Den.
Thanks, Scott. Evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. Scott said I basically kicked the company off in 1992 in Tauranga. By 1994, I did my first syndication in Tauranga. Office building, 2.2 million. So it's quite big stuff back in the day, with about 13 investors going into that. Interesting thing is that building is in direct office fund today. It's still there today, functioning as it's always done. So one of the things that's the cornerstones of how I operate it and how the companies continue to operate is we have a very simple equation when we're looking at property, just 2 questions: where is it and what is it? So where is it? That's simple, location. What is it? What are we dealing with here in this property? If these tenants aren't here tomorrow, what can I do with that building? That probably sort of leads into my whole philosophy around commercial property and property full stop. It's a very long-term view that I take. Intergenerational is how some of my clients have described it, and that's probably a good way to describe it. If you look around the world at some of the wealthiest families, whether they be in the UK, Europe or America, basically they have a philosophy that is very long-term when it comes to owning property. They're acquirers of property. They typically don't sell it. You don't even have to look that far. If you look around New Zealand, I'm sure we can all think of families that meet that sort of criteria. I can certainly think of a number in Auckland who basically have been acquiring since the 1950s and have never sold a single property in that time. So they understand the intergenerational nature of what they're dealing with. Quite different to, I guess, a lot of the markets today, equities being an example. And to me, equities are also a long-term play, but too many people see it as something that we should be able to flip and make a dollar on. Well, that's not where we come from. As I say, the first property I syndicated is still out there today doing what it did back in 1994. I think the syndication model, and I don't say this in any way to blow my own trumpet, but I was certainly one of the first syndicators in the country. In fact, I wrote the script on how to do it as far as the Securities Commission were concerned. And the Securities Commission were the forerunner to the Financial Markets Authority today. So, in terms of that, my view was, if I could just put some investors into a building and put 100,000 each in or whatever, spread the risk, diversification, which is where I was coming from. That's all it was. It was simply a diversification play. It wasn't rocket science. Luckily enough, people got it as the years went by, and more people came along and joined the family. We went through the GFC. So this is my fourth recession, I'll have to say that, which probably explains the receding hairline. But this is my fourth recession, so there's nothing new here. And I see other similar hairlines around the audience, and I'm sure you guys have seen what I've seen, and I'm sure you understand the principles. If you're in it for the long term, it doesn't matter about the ups and the downs and the cycles. But this is the fourth one. It's different. It's certainly different to the other three. The early 90s, we saw the result of the stock market crash in 87. It didn't actually hit the commercial property market till the early 90s. So that was a very interesting time to be in property. Then along came the Asian crisis, bit of a glitch, but then the mother of all recessions, not quite a depression, but a bad recession in the GFC. Now, the properties that I'd put together as syndicates individually weathered that storm really, really well. But it did sharply put into very sharp focus for me, in any given building, if there were 4 or 5 tenants and you lost 2 or 3 of them, you've got a problem. It's going to impact on cash flow and returns. So out of the GFC, I basically formed the view, if syndication was good for diversification, what about a fund structure? Surely that's got to be more robust and even more resilient and more diversified. So this gentleman, Scott, joined me in 2012, and believe me, he looked a lot younger in those days as well. He's aged a lot in 8 years. So he joined me in 2012, and I was already, my wheels were turning towards a fund structure. Scott, to his credit, jumped at that and took that on board. And largely, I think it's fair to say, Scott has driven that whole fund structure and getting it together to where it is today. So we brought a lot of the syndicates in voluntarily over quite a period of time. It wasn't an overnight, you're in or you're not. It was, okay, let's see how this thing goes. If you like what you see, you can come in. They all have. And it took quite a number of years, but they all came in. Some we didn't want to come in. They were actually better on their own. Those people then decided, let's sell the building, then they came in. So the fund structure to me has definitely got the criteria to weather this type of situation that we're currently facing. And I'm sure Scott will use the term today, unprecedented. We are living in unprecedented times. I mean, every time I come to Christchurch, and one of my daughters lives here and works here, loves the place, so we're here quite a bit. I was here over Christmas for 10 days with my wife, and the place was humming. I mean, riverside markets, farmers market, we just thought it was just superb. And every time we come back, we can see more and more progress. But driving around today, it brought it home to me, looking at some of the sites still with the rubble on it. You look at that and think, you guys, Christchurch as a city has survived something that is one in 100 to 1,000 year event. You survived that, so you're coming back from that. This COVID thing, we will survive it. And here we are, probably one of only 8 countries in the world that is actually COVID free. One of 8. We're talking places like the Seychelles, Fiji. So we are, despite politics putting that to one side, whichever side of the divide you're on doesn't matter, we are in a great position now to actually go forward again. Sure, there's casualties, retail, hospitality, tourism, it's obvious. It's going to take some time for those guys to come back. Scott, I'm sure, will talk about the fact that we're not actually exposed to those sectors. And that's some good management, some good luck, as it always is in life. But, life will go on, and the biggest thing that we can do as a people is just get back out there and get back into our routines. I flew down today on an absolutely jam-packed plane. There was not literally one spare seat on the plane. And I sat there and I thought, gee, a week ago, this couldn't happen. And here we are, everyone's sitting there quite happily. So, we will get through this. We got through the GFC, and that was pretty bad. We got through that. We came into this a lot stronger than we did going into the GFC, economically, a lot stronger. Low interest rates, the banks are in good shape, all those good things. So I think all of that bodes well going forward. In terms of the big picture, Look, New Zealand Inc., as I call it, I think is in great shape going forward. Our story, despite what some politicians might have thought coming and going, our story is still one of growing things and farming. Full stop. It has been and still is the backbone of the country. It's keeping the country going at the moment. Tourism, sure, it was a big earner, but it's fallen off a cliff. Farming won't do that. It just won't. Commodity prices might collapse a bit, they might get soft, but the farmers are still there. They're still doing their thing. You know, so it's a unique industry we've got, and we're very good at it. We're very good at growing things. And what does the world want? It wants what we're growing. So, great story. I think looking around the country, there will be winners and losers. If you look at different regions, I mean, who would want to own commercial property in Christchurch at the moment? In hospitality or retail or tourism? Certainly not me. And a year ago, you would have said, gosh, if I could get something in Queenstown at a 3% return, I'll snap it up. So that's certainly going to be impacted. I look at places like Christchurch, which to me it's a great story. It's got that international competitive edge, I believe. The infrastructure spend that's going to be happening here in the next 5 to 10 years is amazing. You know, this new stadium that is now being kicked along, literally, fantastic thing to have. So every time we come down, we see more and more things happening, and it's a growing story. In terms of a place to live, so that's why my daughter and her partner are here. Very attractive in terms of being able to own their first home. Could they do that in Tauranga? No, probably twice the price for the same home. So it will attract people, and it will attract overseas people. The world is looking at us at the moment, and you know the bouquets are flowing in terms of how we've handled this thing and where we're at. There are a lot of people around the world going, I wish I could live there. So that will happen. That will, again, the taps will be turned on in time. That will happen. So going forward, I think Christchurch has got a great story to tell. In terms of the property that we're currently buying, Scott will explain the thoughts behind that and why we're doing it and what it means. But in terms of the situation here economically, interest rates are going nowhere for the next 3 years. We know that. So that's definitely going to, buoy things up from our point of view. The government is pouring a lot of money into basically supporting the economy. The Reserve Bank's made all the right moves. They've done all the right things. And talking to one of the investors in the room tonight, just previously, I think back to my only sort of reference points are the 87 stock market crash, Asian crisis and GFC. But when you think back to the 1930s, the Great Depression, I don't know why they called it great. There was nothing great about it. It destroyed a generation. But when you think back to that, so Margaret was telling me, on her farm at the time, in the 30s, the family that owned the farm, they were actually planting trees just as a job creation scheme to give people jobs. So, you think back to that era, and the governments worldwide at that time did not have the response at their fingertips that governments today do. They did not start printing money. There was no quantitative easing. There was no massive welfare support. And that's why the recession ran so long and so deep. So, politicians have learned over the last 70 years or whatever, longer, that, things like this happen. You've got to jump in. You've got to take action. And they've done it. So from my point of view, New Zealand Inc., would I want to be anywhere else? No, absolutely not. Get that bubble open with Aussie, and I think things will really start to pick up again. So it's my 4th cycle. I don't lose any sleep over it. The sky isn't falling. Our properties are still doing what they should be doing. And the scale of them, and the size of them, and the quality of the tenants, they'll continue to do that. So as a defensive sort of mechanism, I can't personally think of anything better. And 75% of people on the MBR rich list, 75% of them cite cash flow from commercial property as being their primary source of income. Now, that's not to say that that's how they made their money. They didn't. Some of them started with whatever, but neither primary source of income, commercial property. So these are generally pretty smart people. They've figured it out. So if we're able to open that up to everybody else, we're happy to do it. So thank you very much for your time, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Dennis, what did the 1930s depression feel like?
Wasn't good.
You'll notice I only asked that question when out of arm's reach as well. So that was the world economy. Governments around the world very much are on the process of conquering the health, crisis. Where's the economy from here? So we're starting to pose some of these questions. John Kenneth Galbraith, he's the late economist, Canadian-born economist in the States, was quoted, "There are two types of forecasters, those that don't know and those that don't know they don't know." So quite frankly, none of us can predict the future. What we can do is start to understand trends and what that might evolve in terms of those trends as moving forward. What we can do is start to manage strategy and manage risk around that strategy. What we can do is take a long-term view, particularly when dealing with commercial real estate, and exactly what we've done, I guess, from day one in terms of our philosophy of not trying to pick the ups or downs of economic cycles. So commercial real estate, the market, we've certainly seen some sectors impacted more than others, as Dennis talked about. And the media have done a good job in blowing up saying commercial real estate is buggered. The reality is very, very dangerous doing that, or taking that sort of view really, where there's only been a couple of sectors that have really been impacted, certainly retail, hospitality, tourism. What we're finding is sectors that are well underpinned in good locations, i.e. quality, with good tenants in strong locations are holding up well in the sense of value, and there's still certain good demand there from an investor perspective, so something worthy of just keeping in mind. This is quite different to the GFC in the sense of where we are today relative to where we were back in 2007. The listed property vehicles, unlisted funds, had higher debt back in 2007 relative to today, something between late 40 to early 50% loan to value ratios. Today, if you look at the listeds, between 30-35%, so a lot more conservative in the sense of their own balance sheets. Vacancy is actually at all-time lows, not just in office, but all sectors. So you look at CBD prime office assets in Auckland, vacancy in 2007 was at 14%, today 6%. Vacancy CBD prime Christchurch, 5.7% today, back in 2007, over 10%. So we're in a better space, there's less capacity in the market, so that's going to help provide that shock absorber should we see some challenges in the months or years ahead. We all know we're in a low interest rate environment, and I guess from a property fund perspective, that's lowering our operating costs. So it's going to help to absorb some of the shocks that we may see from income from certain tenants over the coming months or years ahead as well. So that's quite important. Banks are very, very much in a stronger position now. They've got more capital on their balance sheets. Speaking to the bankers I'm speaking to, their loan books are a lot tighter now than they were back in 2007, and we all know the global financial crisis was quite that. Bad loan books, subprime lending and the likes, and that's what emanated around the world coming out of the States. So we are in a better space from a banking perspective. That's really important for the purposes of ensuring capital continues or starts to flow around the economy in the months and I guess short years ahead. And as we've seen of late, and Dennis talked about, governments and central banks are prepared to do what it takes. Contrast that back to late 20s, early 30s. We didn't have the tools that they're using now. $110 billion of fiscal and monetary stimulus going into the economy in the next 12 to 18 months. And I'll talk a bit about what we think might ensue as a result of that with a graph to share with you shortly. So this is just a graph of directly held and unlisted properties. Now the series there is hard to see from the back, from the left-hand side, 1994 through to 2018. So what it's showing, if you invested $100 in directly held real estate in commercial property in 1994, in 2018 it's worth $775, so 775% growth over that time. Now that's despite going through two recessionary periods there. On the left, Asian financial crisis, 97, 98, and as we know, GFC, 07, 08 and onwards essentially. So I guess the key message Dennis talked about earlier is when investing in real estate, particularly commercial property, taking a long-term view through economic cycles is really important, and it will look after you. And so I guess that's the approach that we take in the sense of how we position our funds, taking a longer-term view. This graph just shows you essentially the four main central banks around the world: Bank of England, European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, and the Federal Reserve. So the dark blue line there is the size of the balance sheets of those four banks. So you can see there in the middle, 2008, started growing quite rapidly. That was obviously money printing when we came through from the GFC for another 8 years or so. $11 trillion of monetary stimulus by central banks around the globe pumped into the economies. And we all know what happened in terms of asset price inflation. The dotted line is the MSCI Share World Index, basically a proxy for the share market around the world. So you can see it's quite closely correlated with the size of central bank balance sheets. Now I'm not saying it's directly correlated, there's lots of other factors that play into that as well, But point being, as more liquidity is moving around the globe, we're seeing asset price inflation on the back of that. From 2020, we've had commitments of over $22 trillion of fiscal monetary stimulus go into the global economy, and that will continue. So I guess the view is we will see that influence asset prices in the coming years ahead. When will that happen? Well, no one really knows. Certainly at the point where unemployment becomes less of a concern or I guess a factor for individuals or employees. So the long story is a very good one, in that if you're participating in real estate, now more than ever is the best time to be jumping in and getting involved, taking a longer term view with what we're likely to see moving forward. I want to talk a little bit about office now. So I talked about earlier, we've principally had this largest global work from home experiment ever, and a lot of people suggesting, we're just going to work from home from now on in. And the work and I guess the sort of research that we've been doing dispels some of those theories, and I want to share some of those thoughts with you now. Useful to go back in history to understand what the future might look like. This is one of the first offices in London. That's East India Trading Company, built in 1729, just under 300 years ago. Now, they built that for really three reasons. Firstly, to bring people together. Secondly, to help them communicate, collaborate. And thirdly, they needed to be next to all the paperwork, the documentation. Now, the reality is technology has evolved for over 300 years, and you don't need to be next to the filing cabinet like we used to 300 years ago. But certainly the first two, being near people and collaborating, communicating, is important back then as they are now. It's also useful to look at some trends as to what are we seeing and what are we likely to see. And COVID really has sped the trends up probably 10 years or so. So if you think about office density, so how many people are we essentially stuffing into offices per square metre? Back in 1998, prime CBD Auckland office asset, 21 square metres per person. Today, somewhere around 16.5 square metres per person on average. So we're becoming more efficient in the way we're using office space. The cost of office occupancy is increasing, and that's just principally a function of increasing or inflationary pressures around the cost to build real estate, and that's reflecting through into the occupancy cost per square metre. What's interesting though, the cost per person of an individual occupying or using space is actually coming down. So since 2016 to 2020, we've seen about $100 per person reduction in the average cost per person in office space. Humans are becoming more efficient in the way we use space, and that's driven by cost, that's driven by being smarter about the way we go about things, and I'll talk a bit about some of that shortly as well. We've seen this phenomenon, co-working. You've heard, what's the co-working, global co-working outfit, Mac? WeWork around the world, proliferation, and that's been quite global. Certainly in New Zealand, we've seen that over the last 4 to 5 years really grow. Flexi-working, work from home. Progressive firms have been encouraging humans to take more of a holistic approach to work and life. And we've been seeing this. COVID has pushed us forward probably 10 years, and I'll talk a bit about a survey shortly. In fact, actually, I'll talk about that right now. How's that? So Colliers International did a survey, 25 countries, 4,000 people. And so we talked about this global work from home experiment. So what did you think? What's your view of the world? 70% of them said, yes, we could work from home 1 to 2 days a week. Over 60% of them said, actually, it's improved the work-life balance. And principally what I think is actually we haven't had to sit in traffic for 2 or 3 hours a day. Over 50% said, actually, we do miss bumping into colleagues in the workplace, either for work-related or non-work-related conversations. And again, just under 60% said, actually, it's easier to collaborate in the office than at home over Zoom or Microsoft Teams or the virtual meetings. So some interesting insights from Colliers. That was done about 3 weeks ago. I think the reality is what people say back then versus what they say in maybe 3 to 4 months' time will change, and that 70% will be a lot lower in the respect of actually who would be prepared to work from home relative to the office. And I'll talk about human psyche around that soon. So Auckland, 1998. Dennis, you were still around then. Fantastic, going through the Asian crisis. There was a power outage. 3 cables failed successfully in a short space of time. Businesses within the CBD had to relocate to suburban areas or send their staff home. Took 5 weeks to repair. When they came back, a chap by the name of Alan McMahon, namesake for Dennis, surveyed the individuals in the offices in the CBD. Why did you come back? And the response was overwhelmingly, we need to be where the commerce is. We need to be around other people. And so that was back in '98, and yes, technology's moved on since then, but again, we're getting an underlying theme starting to come through here as to why offices. There's a chap called Mario Small, who's a sociologist. Don't ask me why I was reading this stuff, but I was. He's a professor at Harvard. He has done some work around human psychology and the interaction with office space, or I guess the built environment. His sort of core, I guess, thesis was humans crave interaction and are drawn to places that provide it. And so office environments are clearly places that provide physical interaction. Physical interaction is very much a catalyst for innovation, creativity, and knowledge transfer. Very hard to do that remotely or virtually. And so the office environment very much delivers on that, which is critical to the success of any business in today's, I guess, modern environment. What the office environment Mario talked about is it gives individuals a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. Every business needs to have culture, purpose, and what that does is also foster loyalty. Very hard to foster loyalty in a virtual environment, which is again why offices will be very important in, I guess, the new normal moving forward. Providing a sense of identity for individuals is clearly important as well. And what the office environment does is ensure that even the discipline of getting up in the morning, putting on a certain set of clothes, acting and behaving a certain way is really quite critical. First day back at work, one of our staff turned up in his slippers. And so, I think, and that's fine. And the way we're actually interacting now is very different. We actually got to see a very human side of some of our colleagues and peers and throughout the office environment over virtual Zoom for the last 8 weeks working at home. Kids running through, screaming at buddy, wife, what are you doing, all that good stuff. So it was quite human and it was quite refreshing. I think we'll grab onto some of that, but we'll certainly, if my team are anything to suggest, we're busting the boiler to get back into the office and be around other people and start to talk business again. What the office environment does is gives variety. So the risk from working at home is you're very task orientated and it's all about focusing on this task, next task, next task. It's very monotonous. Working in an office environment provides variety throughout the day. You could be a team leader, a subordinate, a peer, confidant, an ally, a customer service rep. The roles vary throughout the day. And from a human psychology perspective, that's actually quite important to ensure that we've got good peace of mind, state of mind. One risk for younger generation, which Unispace did a research article a few weeks ago, is if we're working remotely all of the time, there's a real risk that we'll be out of sight, out of mind. So we passed over for giving additional responsibility. We passed over for giving promotions. And like it or not, it doesn't matter how efficient you are from home, if you're not seen by the boss or the team leaders or the leadership to be with that attitude and really pushing on, you're going to be passed over. And so presence is going to be really important in the sense of what that looks like. And we run the risk of actually treating people more like robots if we don't have that physical interaction as well. And probably, to me, more importantly, is businesses, our tenants, are competing and will compete for talent. And I guess who you're going to work for, someone who's got their staff working from home in a monotonous way without that creativity, innovation and knowledge transfer. We're going to go to work with a business that's actually quite dynamic, using the space well, but provides those, those attributes that, meets all these sort of fundamentals of human psychology. So in our view, the future of office is very much alive and well and will continue to be on the back of what we believe is the new normal. So the best of the both worlds, working from home, absolutely, there'll be a bit more of that. And that's a good thing, in terms of travel time and managing, balancing life with family and work and all that good stuff. But certainly the office will be important as well for those reasons I just talked about. So what do we think in terms of the office property market moving forward? And I'm not just saying this because we manage an office fund and we've currently got another offer in the market. We've been doing some serious thinking about this and anticipating some of this. Flexi working, yes, certainly short term we'll see a bit of a spike in that. And over time that will dissipate back a little bit as we start to get used to working back in the environment again. Working through Vodafone today, seeing all those individuals, pretty much the whole office back, then absolutely we'll see sort of a reversion to that. I've got no doubt large corporates will be looking hard at their office space usage, making some hard decisions in the coming years, using I guess an environment like this as an opportunity to reduce certain headcount and then start again. So that will definitely play out in the months ahead. Will it change the way we use office space in terms of square meterage in the short term? We don't necessarily think so. Regionally, there's going to be a bit more pain, perhaps a lift in vacancy there. And if we do see that lift in vacancy, we're likely to see a reduction or a bit of downward pressure on rents as well. So that's to be thought of in terms of your exposure in more regional sort of fringe locations. And what we had seen this prior to even COVID was actually a reduction or reducing amount of supply coming on the market, both here but also up in Auckland and Wellington as well. And certainly that supply is going to dry up for the next 3 years or more, fundamentally underpinned by confidence and demand. If we don't have either, new supply is not going to happen. Overlay that with bank funding, that's not too forthcoming for developments at the moment. That's going to help underpin existing supply within the market. So again, another one of those shock absorber effects I talked about earlier. The flight to quality is quite sort of observant at the moment. We're seeing investors, we're seeing tenants even starting to ask the questions, well, if we're going to be a bit more efficient with the way we use space, we want to be in an environment that actually works for us, and a higher quality environment as well. So more longer term, and the trend has been there, it's all about the human experience. Designing space to suit human needs. So creating environments where we can have collaboration and innovation and knowledge transfer, all that good stuff. But having quiet areas within the office also to get on and get tasks done. And then the social aspect as well. So the way we design and deliver space will continue to evolve and change. So I guess it's important, the adaptability to change as a property funds manager, to have autonomy and I guess the thought process to anticipate some of that change and actually adapt or evolve your offering to ensure that you're not getting left behind, because you're fundamentally in value depletive assets as opposed to assets that are going to underpin value and grow over time. And that's part of Steve Williams' job, our asset manager who's down with us today in Auckland, to add value and anticipate some of that change. So we will see a shift to quality from tenants, and we're already seeing that now, and we're certainly seeing a shift to quality from investors, and that's natural in an economic environment where we are just now. And that's a big reason as to why 6 or 7 months ago we were looking very hard at the Vodafone acquisition, for just that reason in terms of where we could see the environment moving and our desire and importance to ensure we've got resilience and robustness to scale and strength within our portfolio in the office fund. So I just want to leave with you a couple of key messages before I hand across to Matt. So office buildings very much will continue to remain in demand. Yes, we'll see those trends continue and probably have sped up. It's important to anticipate those trends and be trying to be ahead of them to some extent. We will see more of the best of both worlds in the way we use office space. Our view has always been diversification is key, so we're not going to pick the right ones all the time, but spreading that risk across buildings, geographies and tenants is going to more often than not enable us to be more successful than having just exposure to one building or tenant. Focusing more so on tenant resilience, and Matt will talk a bit about the exposure we have to what we consider resilient industries from an income perspective, from an investment perspective, and ultimately what that means in terms of returns, bottom line. Having a proactive manager, anticipating change, not just waiting for a vacancy and putting a sign up, rolling the sleeves up and actually proactively seeking new tenants and keeping buildings and space full is really important. And as we talked about earlier, investing for the long term, so not trying to pick the ups and downs of a cycle. People will ask us, why are you investing and issuing capital in a market like this? Well, we didn't know, COVID wasn't even a term 6 months ago. Our view is we've always taken a long-term view. A great quality properties come along. It suits the strategic mandate for the portfolio. Let's get on with it. And we've got great support from our clients to date. Matt will talk a bit about that as well. I guess the big thing is lots of rhetoric out there, media commentators. Put the newspapers aside, make your own mind up as to where we see things are at. They're certainly not nearly as bad as what people maybe lend them to be. Yes, we've got some pain ahead of us, no doubt, and we're certainly not immune to that. I guess our view is we've set ourselves up as best we can to weather the storm and again be successful down the line. So I guess that's sort of key messages that I just want to leave with you today.
Thank you, Scott. Good afternoon, everybody. Just wanted to touch on my own situation actually about the work from home example I was explaining to Cam and Jeremy earlier this afternoon. I have a 6-month-old at home at the moment who's 4 months going through a sleep regression in the middle of lockdown. And working from home, I could tell you I hated it. There was no other way to put it, and you could not get me back into the office soon enough. Level 3 hit. I was in there almost every day. Level 2, so on and so forth. I was aiming to do 1 day a week from home. I haven't had that 1 day yet. So there's an example, a very real example around how this works for some. It doesn't work for all. And we were walking around the Vodafone building earlier this morning, and there's a lot of young staff that work in Vodafone. And you ask the question, are you happy to be back at work? Yes, absolutely. Why is that? And it comes back to that desire for social connection, interaction, as Scott and Den both talked about. These are our friends. We interact with them in the workplace, but we also interact with them outside of the workplace. Coming to work is as much about us spending time with the people we like as it is about doing the job. So if you're an employer that's not offering office accommodation moving forward, Scott talked about loyalty. Where do your loyalties lie? Are there other opportunities elsewhere at 2 Degrees or Spark or somewhere else down the road that we can look to if Vodafone aren't going to provide that type of accommodation? So just some really sort of telling examples around how there are always sort of two sides to the coin. And that's very much the case in my own personal situation. Look, just a quick disclaimer, we do have a live offer in the market at the moment. A product disclosure statement is available on request and free of charge as always. Myself and my team, although qualified to do so, will not provide personalised investment advice to any clients. If you decide that that's a service that you would like to undertake, you want some personalised advice around that, we'd very much encourage you to find a authorised financial advisor who's willing and able to do so, of which there are plenty around. I suppose the next sort of 10 minutes, 15 minutes is all about why Christchurch, why the Vodafone building, and how that incorporates into the PMG Direct Office Fund. And I appreciate the PMG Direct Office Fund until now has been a North Island centric fund, and there are probably people in the room that actually don't know the history or what we've bought and what we've sold and how we've developed that fund over time. So I'll talk a bit about that as well. Look, it is, from a strategy sort of big picture sort of setting, it is an office-centric or office sector-specific office fund. It doesn't own anything other than office real estate. It is designed, as is all PMG funds, to offer regular, reliable cash returns to investors over long periods of time. It is designed to grow value. I sometimes refer to this fund as the roll-up-its-sleeves fund. It does like to, and this is a residential sort of phrase or term, it likes to buy sometimes the worst house in the best street. So we look very much to location, and we are not afraid from finding buildings that might have a little bit of vacancy, or perhaps the floor plates are too large and that's why there's vacancy there, and perhaps we need to spend the money and do the work to reduce those, or conversely expand those to attract the right tenants, which therefore adds more income and therefore adds more value. So just not coincidentally at all, by pure design, the PMG Direct Office Fund has offered some of the strongest returns out of our suite of PMG funds, averaging almost 11.5% year on year over the last sort of 4 years for original investors. So part of that is capital gain. Original units were $1, they're now $1.18, but also cash flow on the way through, averaging around 6.5 to 7.5%. Portfolio quality is absolute paramount though, and we can do that through repositioning and refurbishing sort of older assets, improving tenant covenant, WALTs, so average leases and value, but it's also through acquiring really high quality buildings such as your Vodafone asset here locally as well. Here we go. So the journey, just a refresher for those that know and those that don't. So we established the fund in December 2016, and that was through, as Den pointed out, rolling up a number of appropriate previously syndicated buildings that fell into this fund. We started divesting assets which we thought had come to sort of 12 o'clock in the property cycle, and we wanted to take that off the table and recycle that capital, as I said, into assets which represented future value add potential, be them sort of older assets for refurb or redevelopment or newer assets. So we've done a little bit of this over the last few years. You can see we've made some purchases and made some divestments along the way and been recycling capital accordingly. This is an example. So this is 143 Durham Street, and this is one of the buildings that was the first, I think, Dennis, was originally syndicated in 1994. There are many of the original investors that were there in 1994 still invested via the Direct Office Fund. Since this fell into the fund structure, we've, as you can see there, and through Steve's team, we've identified a strategic sort of asset management plan. How do we add value to this? How do we chop and cut space to attract and retain better quality tenants? The net result of that, the valuation gain the last sort of year or two has been well north of sort of $500,000. Its sister building right next door at 127 Durham Street has been vacant for some time whilst we worked on a deal with Waikato University. Waikato University are now in that building, signed a lease for 10 years. It's been a full refurbishment, and there's been a significant valuation gain on the value of that asset as well. So there's a couple of examples, I suppose, from an external perspective, how our team via Steve, Simi and the likes goes through and strategically lifts the quality of these assets and the performance. So highlights for 2020 for this fund, we maintained our distribution at 7.5 cents per unit. We had a valuation gain from $1.12 to $1.18, which reflected almost 5.5% of capital growth. Had it not been for COVID and sort of the ensuing sort of question marks around what that may mean for office and businesses, that valuation was looking likely to be probably over $1.20, somewhere around $1.22, $1.23. So we did ask the valuers to somewhat, as best they can, although it was incredibly difficult, to reflect the impact of COVID and what that might mean in terms of this valuation. So that has sort of been factored in here to a degree, albeit it's a bit of that in the moment in terms of values. I've talked about annualised year-on-year returns. We made 2 acquisitions last year in terms of trying to provide an improvement in quality portfolio quality, one of which was in Ellerslie, leased largely or 100% leased to government tenants. And that's important when it comes to resilient income, particularly in a time like we are in now. And Victoria Street, Hamilton, which is almost completely leased to Kiwibank, or a large degree leased to Kiwibank. So good resilient income provider there. We maintain a relatively conservative level of gearing here. If you compare this to listed property companies, they probably average between sort of low 30s to mid 30s. So we are there or thereabouts with our listed peers. It's a misconception, I think, that the syndicators or unlisted property fund managers carry higher levels of debt. With PMG, that's not necessarily the case. It is true with some standalone syndicates, but not with us. And we maintain a very high degree level of occupancy. Steve, this is about as much kudos you're going to get from me ever in one evening, but I put that down to the strategic asset management work that our asset management team does. We have a very much a partnership approach with our tenants, so much so that in light of the last couple of months, we've had tenants who are quite happy to negotiate rent relief and be quite sort of supportive around that, because they understand that they've got a strong landlord, one that will look after them, one that works in partnership with them, and that helps us retain these types of quality tenants. And for an office portfolio to be maintaining occupancy at 97, 98%, when office tenants are naturally a lot more transient than industrial tenants that sort of make stuff and move stuff and have a high degree of financial commitment to their sites. I think maintaining occupancy around that, and soon I'll talk about average lease terms, is really a testament to PMG's approach. We're here to talk about this sexy thing, the Vodafone Innovate building down the road. As I said, I was there today, and I suppose everyone's local here, so you would have been past it, but it really does. It's a standout asset once you go through it, and once you look at it, and you get appreciation for where this sits within sort of the city centre. Just want to touch quickly on the Christchurch market. So we've talked about Christchurch offers some of the best amenity and most modern infrastructure, not only probably within New Zealand but around the globe. It truly is, and as Scott and Dennis said, every time we get down here, it's taken another step in the right direction. Truly is a fantastic city to live and work in, and huge infrastructure spend post-quakes. Not only sort of amenity, but an enviable workforce. So the average age of your working population down here is about 37 years old. Now, if you compared that to the likes of Tauranga or some of the regions, that is significantly younger, and one that those regions would love to have, but we just can't accommodate for reasons that Den talked about. The average house price or median house price in those other major metros is over 600 grand. In Christchurch, it's about 450. So if you're a young family or a young couple or even on your own and you're trying to get on the ladder, you're looking for strong work opportunities in this area. You're looking for access to really good amenity, bars, cafes, restaurants, gyms. You're also wanting access to the outdoors. You wouldn't live in Christchurch if you didn't like skiing or mountain biking or fishing or boating or surfing or whatever it is. You've got some of the best and most leading sort of world-class activities literally on your doorstep. This stuff helps encourage young people to want to live and work here. And it's important that from a building perspective, we look for location and amenity within a pretty close proximity to support those desires and wants. New Zealand's second largest international airport doesn't mean much right now because no one's coming in. But generally speaking, and once the borders open, Christchurch is the centre point for movement around the South Island, largely. unless you're Aussie skiing and you go straight to Queenstown. Still not happening yet either. But once this happens, people will flock back to Christchurch. This is where they come. They don't just move from here, they spend time here. Christchurch has history, before the quakes as well, but more so now. And people want to experience that. They want to see how the city is rebuilt, and they spend time here, money here, and actually some you will find stay here, and they want work, and they want to buy real estate, and they want to spend money. So overall, we look at this and we think, Christchurch is a very attractive investment destination. For us, we've been sold on that for a wee while. Now it's about, or at the point 12 months ago, it was about what do we want to own. Coming back to, look, there is a real yield gap between prime office yields and interest rates, and with sort of the further reduction in interest rates, that yield gap's going to split open a little further. So we're looking at this and saying, there is a real advantage over the cost of debt here for us to own real estate in Christchurch. Other major metros such as Auckland, that yield's probably 5.5. We can get 6.5 here. So for a fund that's looking to achieve greater diversification, and one way is we look for geographical diversification, very much attracted to the geographical diversification piece, but it also makes sense from a yield perspective. We expect that other large institutions, fund managers, syndicators will see this and be looking at this pattern too. For some time and into the future, they'll be saying, there is good reason for us to be down there too, and that puts pressure on your available stock for sale and can help stabilise prices or even help them grow. And you look at this from an international perspective, you see Christchurch here, in terms of your sort of scale of global prime office yield spreads. So if you're an overseas investor in Singapore or London or the States or anywhere else, you look at, say, Hong Kong, your average prime office yields are down sort of under 1%, out at about 2.5%, versus Christchurch sort of up here at sort of 6.5. The Overseas Investment Act is pretty loose when it comes to offshore capital investing in New Zealand real estate, which is not deemed sensitive, not like rural land or agricultural or horticultural land. So why would you invest necessarily in those markets offshore that have not squashed COVID, that are not back at work, when you can invest here in an environment, NZ Inc., which has squashed COVID, and we're back at work and we're getting on with things, and your yield is about 4 points higher? Makes sense to me. Just want to talk about what might happen to rents, and I know there's agents in the room might have different views, but I think post sort of quakes, you obviously had a lot of buildings fall over, and we had corporate and professional tenants and the likes that had to move out of the city into the fringes. They had to take, wouldn't take short-term leases, they had to take longer-term leases, and we had to wait for supply to come back into the market through development. So what we saw is that we had a bit of an exodus, and we had a bit of an excess of demand and low supply. So, an excess of, lost my train of thought. We had an exodus of tenants out of the CBD, and we had to wait for that supply to come into the market. And now what we see is some of those tenants that have left and are wanting to come back in are putting pressure again on available stock. We're unlikely to see more available stock come to the market because bank funding for development is going to be a challenge. So I think Christchurch is a bit of a uniqueness in that regard, and so we should expect to see some pressure on rents because we're going to see a continuation of those tenants that have moved out wanting to move back into the CBD. In terms of the location of this building, I walked from here to where we are right now. It's about 800 metres, about a 5 or so minute walk. We like the location because of its sort of profile at High Street, Madras Street, and Chuam Street. So we like the location in terms of its bordering. It's a high profile site, it's well car parked, innovation car park building behind it. It provides for, I suppose, other cool sort of amenities or things like bike storage and bike racks. But big things for us are the bus interchange. Another big thing for us is the convention centre and the multi-purpose sports stadium. The one central residential project is a Fletcher's project. It's not designed to be a short-term development project, I believe. This could be 5-10 years plus. But this will see potentially hundreds, if not thousands, of people living and working here within the CBD. And those people are predominantly probably going to be younger people, and they will want to work somewhere nearby. someone that is providing world-class access to world-class amenities and facilities. We like this location from a long-term perspective. The building itself, designed by Jasmax, constructed by Calder Stewart, arguably probably one of the best construction firms in the country, not known for cutting corners. They build things and build things well. One of the few buildings in Christchurch that has a 5-star green rating. That's important to businesses like Vodafone. They have obviously a carbon footprint that they want to try and offset as best as possible. A lot of these big corporates, an easy way to do that is to lease green space. And to achieve this rating, you need to evidence services such as water reticulation, energy efficiency around lights, natural lighting, recycling and diversion of waste to recycling centres, etc., etc. So it's not easy to obtain and maintain these, but this is an asset that does that. We have done some work in terms of future use. It does have sort of future use potential down the line in terms of conversion to hotels or smaller office tenancies as well. Look, before we own the Vodafone asset, the portfolio currently stands at 7 buildings, it's actually 53 tenants now, I believe. A return at 6.5 cents per unit from 1 June. Weighted average lease term at 3.9 years. Portfolio gearing occupancy, we can read it there. Probably what's more important is what the portfolio looks like post-acquisition. Yes, we moved to 8 buildings, 54 tenants, but the key things I look to are your weighted average lease term. So the Vodafone as a company have over 8 years remaining on their lease at this stage. That does a lot for our weighted average lease term. As an investor, you look to your WALT to determine your sort of term certain income for a period of time. So we know that the average lease across that portfolio is not due to expire for over 5 years. Interestingly, if you compare that to companies like Goodman Property, who operate a industrial specific sort of portfolio set, they maintain a weighted average lease term of around 5 years too. But we would normally expect industrial tenants to take or have a longer running average lease term. So I think, again, testament to the asset management team in terms of how they're maintaining those figures and ensuring our tenants are happy. Portfolio value ticks up about 60 million. The main benefit there is there are great cost efficiencies that come through scale. Okay, and so when we raise capital in the future, the capital costs remain somewhat sort of stable. There's always that sort of benchmark, and then they can move around a little bit, not too much. So as your portfolio grows, your costs as a percentage of assets owned as we grow the portfolio actually diminishes. So there is real cost efficiencies that come through that scale. And gearing and occupancy largely maintained. Look, all we're trying to show here is after settlement, we obviously have exposure to Christchurch. Our whole model across all our funds is diversification. That's both by geography, and some funds by building type, but also tenant industry. We're quite happy to have some geographical diversification. As we've talked about, different set of drivers here in the Christchurch market. And that's important for a portfolio that's trying to offer a stable, reliable yield. And really, after settlement, we increase our exposure to what we define as sort of defensive industries or defensive businesses, the likes of telecommunications. There is one part of the telco business that, their international roaming service is obviously not providing fruits like it was when everyone was running around the world. But other parts of their business in terms of demand for internet, data, mobile usage, etc. within this country are certainly expanding as well. So it's important, and it's a defensive industry moving forward, especially as we consider that in the context of sort of flexible working a little bit more too. Government remain reasonably stable. You would hope they should be a tenant that always pays the bills. So we like to see a high degree of exposure to that sector and professional services to round that out. So over 75% of this portfolio is weighted to those 3 key sectors which we determined to be more defensive in light of the current environment. What we're showing here is through the acquisition, post-settlement, we're seeing a high degree of our lease expiry heading further outwards, which is really just reinforcing a longer weighted average lease term. You'd want to see that every acquisition you make, your bars are going further to the right. So what are we offering? Offering 6.5 cents per unit, $1.18 per unit, 10,000 minimums, 5,000 thereafter. So it's $11,800 to invest initially, $5,900 thereafter. As I've said, all up there. We covered total portfolio value, mix of tenants, debt. One thing we haven't talked about yet is tax structure. So PMG's funds across the board are structured as PIEs, portfolio investment entity, which are probably going to be tax efficient for most. So if you're paying 30 or 33% tax on cash in the bank or syndicates or whatever else you might be invested in, the PIE tax structure is quite tax efficient from that perspective. It's also taxed at source and paid straight to the IRD. So in terms of the end of year process and trying to work out how much tax I should pay or not pay, no requirement to do that so long as you've applied the appropriate tax rate. So it might save you a few bob in terms of your accountant's fees at the end of the year as well. Our team are based up and down sort of the country, so you should always manage to get a hold of one of us. As I said, this is an offer that's available in the market. We've got documentation out here which you're more than welcome to take with you, as well as copies of these slides if there's information in there that you would like to see and read and retain. Do you want me to close it off? Thank you very much for your time. Great to see everybody here. We're happy to take a few questions if there are any for myself, Scott or Dennis. Now, liquidity. You can't sell. No. You can sell. We've been working pretty hard over the last probably 5 years to develop a more robust secondary market. The product helps with that because the old syndication model was minimum 50, 100, 200,000, right? So your potential buyers pool for investment product like that was sort of this big. By reducing the minimums down, you increase your potential investor pool to sort of this point. Equally, OCR rates sort of dropping through the floor has pushed interest rates on TDs really low. Our yields or commercial property yields have maintained. There's been a real sort of risk premium there. So we look at that, or our investors look at that, and have been more attracted to this stuff as a result. So now we have sort of over 1,000 active investors because of those couple of things. We have a lot more discussion around intergenerational investing now, coming back to how Dean started this presentation. So for us, Jordan and I, the rest of my team, do a lot of coaching around, perhaps we should view ourselves as custodians for this money. We take the income off it and we try and coach our children to be a bit more financially literate around this stuff. And perhaps then they hold on to it, act as custodians, and they leave it for the next generation too. So what we're seeing now is we're obviously bringing on more and more investors, but we're seeing actually less fall away in the back end. And so that's helping with liquidity for those that really do want to sell. Case in point, a 92-year-old investor just had his 92nd birthday last week, called me on Friday. Matt, I want to sell my 500,000 shares in Pacific Property Fund. I said, that won't be a problem. We had a deal done on Monday. So, I say it loosely. If you want to break a term deposit with the bank, normally you've got to give them 30 days notice. So you could argue liquidity is better than banks right now. It may not always be like that.
You did not say that.
I said you could argue. You could argue. It won't always be like that. But the reality is in this environment, why would you flog your 7% income stream or your 6% income stream? Where are you going to put the money? You put it in cash in the bank, give you 1.5%. Bonds aren't much better, probably possibly worse. So you've really got two options. You've got equities or you've got New Zealand real estate, commercial. And for that reason, you're just not seeing the desire to want to sell, but we're still seeing demand come in the other side. And when you've got that demand and supply and balance, it leads to liquidity.
Matt, is there any plan to go public, like getting listed in the
Not at this stage, mate. Yeah. Yep. I suppose our view is there's enough listed players in the market at the moment. And if you want office exposure in a listed sense, you can go to Precinct. If you want retail, although I don't know why, you go to Kiwi. You want industrial, Argosy, PFI, Goodman. Our competitive advantage is that our returns reflect the underlying assets, not market sentiment. So good question, mate. But I suppose that's our view at this stage. Right, 5:15, time for a drink. Thank you all for coming along. This is the best, I think, audience we've had in Christchurch for some time. Obviously, we were sick of being caged animals and wanted to be let loose. So let's have a drink and yeah, thanks very much for coming along.